Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy-Time Tales, the podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Just let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy-Time Tales for a few nights to get used to this slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. Sleepy-Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools that I use and justifying the time that I spend on it, thanks to the generosity of listeners just like you. So if you're finding Sleepy-Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you'd like to help keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but also can get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look at what's on offer, and sign up if you are willing. Also, if monthly seems like a big ask, which is completely understandable, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. Another way to help the show without having to do anything financially on your end is simply to tell people about it. If you know someone who is struggling to sleep, just tell them about Sleepy-Time Tales and encourage them to give it a try. And before we end today, I want to just shout out the fact that this is now episode 250 of Sleepy-Time Tales, which is pretty amazing to me. When I started this out, I wasn't sure how long it was going to go. I've just quietly plugged away doing this weird little project and having a few thousand people a week listen to and enjoy what I'm doing. So I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate everyone who's listened over the time and everyone who's given any support or feedback or anything like that. So thanks for listening, and here's to at least 250 more, hopefully. Enough of that, let's get back to the show. This week we're going to something new. Bellarion the Fortunate by Raphael Sabatini. Book 1. The Threshold. Half god, half beast, the Princess Valeria once described him, without suspecting that the phrase describes not merely Bellarion, but man. Aware of this, the anonymous chronicler who has preserved it for us goes on to comment that the princess said once too much and too little. He makes phrases in his turn, which I will spare you, and seeks to prove that if the moieties of divinity and beastliness are equally balanced in a man, that man will be neither good nor bad. Then he passes on to show us a certain poor swineherd who rose to ultimate eminence, in whom the godly part so far predominated that naught else was humanly discernible, and a great prince, of whom more will be heard in the course of this narrative, who was just as the beasts that perish, without any spark of divinity to exalt him. These are the extremes. For each of the dozen or so intermediate stages which he discerns, our chronicler has a portrait out of history, of which his learning appears to be considerable. From this, from his general manner, From the fact that most of his illustrations are supplied by Florentine sources, and from the austerely elegant Tuscan language in which he writes, a fairly definite conclusion is possible on the score of his identity. It is more than probable that the study of Bellarion the Fortunate, Bellarione il Fortunato, belongs to that series of historical portraits from the pen of Niccolo Machiavelli, of which the life of Castruccio Castracane is probably the most widely known. Research, however, fails to discover the source from which he draws. Whilst many of his facts agree completely with those contained in the voluminous, monkish Vita et Gesta Bellarionis, left us by the friar Serafina of Imola, whoever he may have been, yet discrepancies are frequent and irreconcilable. Thus, at the very outset, on the score of his name, Machiavelli, to cling to my assumption, tells us that he was called Bellarion, not merely because he was a man of war, but because he was the very child of war, born as it were out of the very womb of conflict. The use of this metaphor reveals full acquaintance with the tale of the child's being plucked from the midst of strife and alarms, but Father Serafino's account of the name is the only one that fits into the known facts. That this name should have been so descriptive of Bellarion's afterlife merely provides one of those curious instances of homonymy in which history abounds. Continuing his comments upon the Princess Valeria's phrase, Machiavelli states that Bellarion's is not a nature thus to be packed into a sentence. Because of his perception of this fact, he wrote his biographical sketch. Because of my perception of it, I have embarked upon this fuller narrative. I choose to begin at a point where Bellarion himself may be said to make a certain beginning. I select the moment when he is to be seen, standing upon the threshold of the secular world, known to him until that moment only from the writings of other men, yet better known to him thus than is to many who have lived a lifetime among their fellows. After all, to view a scene from a distance is to enjoy advantages of perspective denied to the actors in that scene. Bellarion's reading had been prodigious. There was no branch of learning, from the theological fathers to Vegetus Hyginus on the art of war, to which he had not addressed his eager spirit. And his exhaustion of all immediately available material for study was one of the causes of his going forth from the peace of the convent of which he was a nursling, in quest of deeper wells of learning, to slake his hot intellectual thirst. Another cause was a certain heretical doctrine, of which it was hoped that further study would cure him. A doctrine so subversive of theological teaching that 100 years later it must have made him closely acquainted with the operations of the Holy Office, and probably, in Spain certainly, have brought him to the fire. This abominable heresy, fruit of much brooding, was that in the world there is not, nor can be, such a thing as sin. And it was in vain that the abbot, who loved him very dearly, sought by argument to convert him. It is your innocence that speaks. Alas, my child, in the world from which hitherto you have been mercifully sheltered, you will find that sin is not only real, but terribly abundant. Bellarion answered with a syllogism, the logical formula to which he had reduced his doctrine. He presented it in the Socratic manner of inquiry, which was the method of argument he ever preferred. Are not all things in the world from God? Is God not the fount of all goodness? Can therefore any created thing be other than good? And the devil then, quoth the abbot. Bellarion smiled. A singularly sweet smile that had the power to draw men's love and lead them into agreement with him. Is it not possible that those who invented the devil may have studied divinity in Persia, where the creed obtains the powers of light and darkness? Hormuzd and Ahriman strive perpetually for mastery of the world. Surely otherwise they would have remembered that if the devil exists, God must have created him, which in itself is blasphemy, for God can create no evil. Aghast, the abbot descended at a stride from the theological to the practical. Is it not evil to steal, to kill, to commit adultery? Ah, yes, but these are evils between men, disruptive of society and therefore to be suppressed, lest man become as the beasts, but that is all. All? The abbot's deep-set eyes surveyed the youth with sorrow. My son, the devil lends you a false subtlety to destroy your soul. And gently now, that benign and fatherly man preached him a sermon of the faith. It was followed by others in the days that ensued. But all the weapons of his saintly rhetoric, Bellarion continued to oppose the impenetrable shield of that syllogism of his, which the abbot knew at heart to be fallacious, yet whose fallacy he laboured in vain to expose. But when the good man began to fear lest this heresy should come to trouble and corrupt the peace and faith of his convent, he consented to speed its author to Pavia, and those further studies which he hoped would cure him of his heretical pravity. And that is how, on a day of August of the year of grace 1407, Bellarion departed from the convent of Our Lady of Grace of Sigliano. He went on foot. He was to be dependent for food and shelter mainly upon the charity of the religious houses that lay on his way to Pavia, and as a passport to these he bore his scrip, a letter from the abbot of the Grassi. Beside it lay a purse, containing for emergencies 5 ducats, a princely sum not only in his own eyes, but in those of the abbot, who at parting had bestowed it upon him. The tale of his worldly possessions is completed by the suit of coarse green cloth he wore, and the knife at his girdle, which was to serve all purposes from the carving of his meat to affording him a means of defence from predatory beasts and men. To fortify him spiritually in his adventurous pilgrimage through Lombardy, had the abbot's blessing and a memory of the fond tears in the eyes of that old man, who had reared him from the age of 6. At last the abbot had again reminded him of the peace of the convent, and of the strife and unhappiness that distract the world. The mischief began, and you may account it symbolical, by his losing his way. This happened a mile or two beyond the township of Livorno, because the peace of the riverside allured a mind that for 17 years had been schooled in peace, because the emerald meadows promised to be soft and yielding to his feet. He left the dusty highway for the grassy banks of Po. Beside its broad waters, winding here about the shallow, pleasant hills of the Montferrat, Bellarion trudged, staff in hand, the green hood of his cape thrown back, the long liripipe trailing like a tail behind him. A tall, lithe stripling of obvious figure, olive-skinned, black-haired, and with dark eyes, that surveyed the world bold and fearlessly. The day was hot, the air was laden with the heavy perfumes of late summer, and the river swollen and clouded by the melting snows on distant Monte Rosa. He wandered on, lost in daydreams, until the sunlight passed with the sinking of the sun, behind the wooded heights across the river, and a breeze came whispering through the trees on his own bank. He checked, his dark eyes alert, a frown of thought rumpling the fair smoothness of his lofty brow. He looked about, became aware of a deep forest on his left, bethought him of the road, and remembered where the sun had set. and realized hence that for some time he had been traveling south, and consequently in the wrong direction. In following the allurements offered to his senses, he had gone astray. He made some homely philosophy upon that, to his infinite satisfaction, for he loved parallels and antitheses and all such intellectual toys. For the rest, there was about him no doubt or hesitation. He computed from the time he had taken and the pace at which he had come, the extent to which he had wandered from the road. It must run too far beyond this forest to leave him any hope of lying that night, as he had intended, with the Augustinian fathers at their house on the Sesia, on the frontiers of the state of Milan. Save for the hunger that beset him, he was undismayed. And what, after all, is a little hunger to one schooled in the most rigid Lenten fasts in season? He entered the wood and resolutely went forward in the direction in which he knew the road to lie. For a half-mile or more he penetrated by a path, growing less visible at every step, until darkness and the forest swallowed him. Better far to lie down and sleep where he was, and wait for the morning sun to give him orientation. So he spread his cloak upon the ground, and this proving no harder as a couch than the pallet to which he was accustomed, he slept soundly and peacefully. When he awakened, he found the sunlight in the forest and something else, of almost more immediate interest. A man in the grey habit of a minor friar. This man, tall and lean, was standing beside him, yet half turned from him in a curious attitude of arrested movement, almost as if the abrupt suddenness with which Bellarion had sat up, a single heartbeat after his eyes had opened, had checked his intention to depart. Thus an instant, then the friar was facing him again, his hands folded within the loose sleeves of his robe, a smile distending his countenance. He uttered a benedictory greeting. Pax tectum? Et tectum frater pax was Bellarion's mechanical answer. What time he studied the stranger's villainous, patibulary countenance, marking the animal looseness of mouth, and the craft peering from the little eyes that were black beads thrust into a face of clay. A closer scrutiny softened his judgment. The man's face was disfigured, ridged, scarred, and pitted from the smallpox. These scars had contracted the skin about his eyes, thus altering their expression. And to the ravages of the disease was also due the sickly pallor overspreading the cheek and brow. Considering this, and the habit which the man wore, a habit which Bellarion had no cause to associate with anything that was not sweet and good, he disposed himself to make amends for the hastiness of his first assumptions. Benedictus Socia murmured, and with that abandoned Latin for the vulgar tongue. I bless the providence that sends you to a poor traveller who has lost his way. The friar laughed aloud at that, and the lingering apprehension left his eyes, which thus relieved grew pleasanter to look upon. Lord, and I, like a fool and a coward, having almost trod upon you, was for creeping off in haste, supposing you a sleeping robber. This forest is a very sanctuary of thieves. They infest it, thick as rabbits in a warren. Why then do you adventure in it? Why? Oh hey! And what shall they steal from a poor friar mendicant? My beads, my girdle. He laughed again. A humorous fellow, clearly, taking a proper saintly joy in his indigenous condition. No, my brother, I have no cause to go in fear of thieves. Yet supposing me a thief, you were in fear of me. The man's smile froze. The stripling's simple logic was disconcerting. I feared, he said at last, slowly and solemnly, your fear of me. A hideous passion, fear, in man or beast. It makes men murderers at times. Had you been the robber I supposed you, and waking suddenly found me beside you, you might have suspected some intent to harm you. It is easily guessed what would have followed then. Bellarion nodded thoughtfully. No explanation could have been complete. The man was not only virtuous, but wise. Whither do you journey, brother? To Pavia, Bellarion answered him, by way of Santa Tenda. Santa Tenda? Why, that is my way too. At least as far as the Augustinian monastery on the Sesia. Wait here, my son, and we will go together. It is good to have a comrade on a journey. Wait but some few moments to give me some time to bathe, which is the purpose for which I came. I will not keep you long. He went striding off through the grass. Bellarion called after him, Where do you bathe? Over his shoulder the friar answered him, There's a rivulet down yonder, but a little way. Do not stray from that spot, so that I might find you again, my son. Bellarion thought the form of address an odd one. A Minorite his brother, not father to all humanity. But it was no suspicion based on this that brought him to his feet. He was a youth of cleanly habits, and if there was water at hand, he too would profit by it. So he rose, picked up his cloak, and went off in the wake of the swiftly moving friar. When presently he overtook him, Bellarion made him a present of a proverb. Who goes slowly goes soundly, but never gets there, was the slightly breathless answer. And it's still some way to the water. Some way, but she said, Aye, I was mistaken. One place is like another in this labyrinth. I'm none so sure that I am not as lost as you are. It must have been so, for they trudged a full mile before they came to a brook that flowed westward toward the river. It lay in a dell amid mossy boulders and spreading fronds of ferns, all dappled now with the golden light that came splashing through the trees. They found a pool of moderate dimensions and a bowl of grey stone fashioned by the ceaseless sculpture of the water. It was too shallow to afford a bath, but the friar's ablutionary dispositions scarce seemed to demand so much. He rinsed face and hands perfunctorily, whilst Bellarion, stripped to the waist, and displaying a white torso of much beauty and more vigour, did what was possible in that cramped space. After that, the friar produced from one of the sack-like pockets of his habit an enormous piece of sausage and a loaf of rye bread. To Bellarion, who had gone supperless to bed, this was the sight of manna in the desert. Little brother, he cooed in sheer delight, little brother. Aye, we have our uses, we little brothers of St. Francis. The Minorite sliced the sausage in 2 equal halves. We know how to provide ourselves upon a journey. They fell to eating, and with the stilling of his hunger, Bellarion experienced an increasing kindliness to this good Samaritan. At the friar's suggestion that they should be moving so as to cover the greater part of the road to Casale before the noontide heat, Bellarion stood up, brushing the crumbs from his lap. In doing so, his hand came in contact with a scrip that dangled from his girdle. Saints of God, he ejaculated, as he tightened his clutch upon that bag of green cloth. The beady eyes of the Minorite were upon him, and as blank inquiry in that ashen, corrugated face. What is it, brother? Bellarion's fingers groped within the bag a moment, then turned it inside out to reveal its utter emptiness. He showed his companion a face which blended suspicion with dismay. I have been robbed, he said. Robbed? The other echoed. then smiled a pitying concern. My surprise is less than yours, my son. Did I not say these woods are infested by thieves and robbers? Had you slept less soundly, you might have been robbed of life as well. Render thanks to God, whose grace is discernible even in misfortune. For no evil befalls us that will not serve to show us how much greater that evil might have been. Take that for comfort ever in adversity, my child. Aye, Bellarion displayed ill humour, whilst his eyes abated nothing of their suspicious glance. It is easy to make philosophy upon the woes of others. Child, what is your woe? What is the full sum of it? What have you lost when all is said? 5 ducats and a letter, Bellarion flung the answer fiercely. 5 ducats? The friar spread his hands in pious remonstrance. And will you blaspheme God for 5 ducats? Blaspheme? It is not your furious frame of mind, a blasphemy, your anger at your loss, where there should be a devout thankfulness for all that you retain. And you should be thankful, too, for the providence that guided my steps towards you in the hour of your need. I should be thankful for that? Bellarion stressed the question with mistrust. The friar's countenance changed. A gentle melancholy invested it. I read your thoughts, child, and they harbor suspicion of me. Of me. He smiled. Why, what a madness. Should I turn thief? Should I imperil my immortal soul for 5 paltry ducats? Do you not know that we little brothers of St. Francis live as the birds of the air? Without thought for material things, I trust entirely in God's providence. What should I do with 5 ducats, or 500, without a single minted coin, with no more than my gown and my staff? I might journey from here to Jerusalem, living upon the alms that never fail us. But assurances are not enough for minds poisoned by suspicion. He flung wide his arms and stood cruciform before the youth. Come, child, make search upon me for your ducats, and so assure yourself. Come. Bellarion flushed and lowered his head in shame. There's not the need, he answered lamely. The gown you wear is a full assurance. You could not be what you are, and yet the thing that for a moment He broke off. I beg that you'll forgive my unworthiness, my brother. Slowly the friar lowered his arms. His eyes were smiling again. I will be merciful by not insisting. He laid a hand, lean and long in the fingers as an eel's claw, upon the young man's shoulder. Think no more of your loss. I'm here to repair it. Together we will journey. The habitus in Francis is wide enough to cover both of us, and you shall not want for anything until you reach Pavia. Bellarion looked at him in gratitude. It was Providence indeed that sent you. Did I not say so? And now you see it for yourself. Benedictamus Domine. To which Bellarion sincerely made the prescribed answer. Deo gratias. The Grey Friar. They made their way towards the road, not directly, but by a course with which Father Sulpicio, as the friar announced himself named, seemed singularly well acquainted. It led transversely across the forest, and as they went, Friar Sulpicio plied Bellarion with questions. There was a letter, you said, that was stolen with your gold. Aye, Bellarion's tone was bitter. A letter worth many times 5 ducats. Worth many times? A letter? The incredulity on the friar's face was ludicrous. Why, what manner of letter was that? Bellarion, who knew the contents by heart, recited them word for word. Friar Sulpicio scratched his head in perplexity. I've Latin enough for my office, but not for this, he confessed. and finding Bellarion's searching glance upon him, he softened his voice to add, truly enough, "We little brothers of St. Francis are not famed for learning. Learning disturbs humility." Bellarion sighed. "So I know to my cost," said he, and therefore translated the lost letter. "This is our dearly beloved son Bellarion, a nutritus of this house, who goes hence to Pavia to increase his knowledge of the humanities. We commend him first to God, and then to the houses of our own and other brethren orders, for shelter and assistance on this journey, involving upon all who may befriend him the blessing of our Lord." The friar nodded his understanding. It might have been a grievous loss indeed, but as it is, I will do the office of your letter whilst I am with you, and when we part, I will see you armed with the like from the prior of the Augustinians on the seashore. He will do this at my word." The young man thanked him with a fervour dictated by shame of certain unworthy suspicions which had recurred. Thereafter they trudged on a while in silence, broken by the friar at last. "And is your name Belisario, then? An odd name, that." "Not Belisario, Bellario, or rather Bellarioni." "Bellarioni? Why, it is even less Christian than the other. Where got you such a name?" "Not at the font, you may be sure. There I was christened Ilario, after the good Saint Hilary, who is still my patron saint." "Then why?" "There's a story to it." "My story," Bellarion answered him, and upon slight encouragement proceeded to relate it. He was born, he told the friar, as nearly as he could guess, some 6 years after the outbreak of the Great Schism. That is to say, somewhere about the year 1384, in a village of whose name, like that of his own family, he had no knowledge. "Of my father and my mother," he continued, "I can evoke no mental picture. Of my father, my only positive knowledge is that he existed. Of my mother, I know that she was a termagant of whom the family, my father included, stood in awe. Amongst my earliest impressions is the sense of fear that invaded us at the sound of her scolding voice. It was querulous and strident, and I can hear it to this day harshly raised to call my sister. Leocadia was that sister's name, the only name of all my family that I can remember, and this because I must often have heard it in that dread voice. There were several of us. I have one vivid memory of perhaps a half-dozen tumbling urchins, playing at some game in a bare, chill room that was yellow, washed, lighted by an unglazed window, beyond which the rain was streaming down upon the narrow, dismal street. There was a clang of metal in the air, as if the armourers were at work in the neighbourhood, and we were in the charge, I remember, of that same Leocadia, who must have been the eldest of us. I have an impression, vague and misty, of a lanky girl whose lean bare legs showed through a rent in her tattered petticoat. Faintly I discern a thin, pinched face set in a mane of untidy yellow hair, and then I hear a heavy step and a creak of a stair and a shrill, discordant voice calling, "Leocadia," and then a scuttle amongst us to shelter from some unremembered peril. Of my family, that is all I can tell you, brother. You'll agree, perhaps, that since my memory can hold so little, is it a pity that it should hold so much? But for these slight impressions of my infancy, I might weave a pleasant romance about it, conceive myself born in a palace and heir to an illustrious name. That these memories of mine concern the year 1389 or 1390, I know from what the abbot tells me, and also from later studies and deductions of my own. As you may know, there was at the time a bitter war being waged hereabouts between Ghibelline Montferrat and Guelphic Morea. It may have ravaged these very lands by which we travel now. One evening at the hour of dusk, a foraging troop of Montferrat horses swept into my native place. There was pillage and brutality of every kind, as you can imagine. There was terror and confusion in every household, no doubt, and even in our own, although heaven knows we had little cause to stand in dread of pillage. I remember that as night descended, we huddled in the dark, listening to the sounds of violence in the distance, coming from what I now imagine to have been the more opulent quarter of that township. I can hear my mother's heavy breathing. For once she inspired no terror in us, being self-stricken with terror and cowed into silence. But this greater terror was upon us all, a sense of impending evil, of some horror advancing presently to overwhelm us. There were snivelling, whimpering sounds in the gloom about me from Leocadia and the other children. It is odd how things heard have remained stamped upon my mind, so much more vividly than things seen, which usually are more clearly remembered. But from that moment my memory begins to grow clear and consecutive, perhaps from the sudden sharpening of my wits by this crisis. It was probably the instinct to withdraw myself beyond the reach of that approaching evil which drew me furtively from the room. I remember groping my way in the dark down a steep, crazy staircase and tumbling down 3 stone steps at the door of that hovel into the mud of the street. I picked myself up, bruised and covered with filth. At another time this might have set me howling. Just then my mind was filled with graver concerns. In the open the noises were more distinct. I could hear shouts, and once a piercing scream that made my young blood run cold. Away on my right there was a red glow in the sky, and associating it with the evil that was to be escaped, I turned down the alley and made off, whimpering as I ran. Soon there was an end to the houses, and I was out of their shadow in the light of a rising moon, on a road that led away from the open country into eternity, for it must have seemed to me. From this, I have since argued either that the township had neither gates nor walls, or else that the mean quarter we inhabited was outside and beyond them. I cannot have been above 5 years of age, and I must have been singularly sturdy, for my little legs bore me several miles that night, driven by unreasoning fear. At last I must have sunk down exhausted by the roadside and there fallen asleep, for my next memory is of my awakening. It was broad daylight, and I was in the grasp of a big, bearded man, who from his cap to his spurs was all steel and leather. Beside him stood the great bay horse from which he had just leapt, and behind him, filling the road in a staring, grinning, noisy cluster, was ranged a troop of fully 50 men with lances reared above them. He soothed my terrors with a voice incredibly gentle and one so big and fierce, and asked me who I was and whence I came, questions to which I could return no proper answers. To increase my confidence, perhaps, he gave me some food, some fruit and bread, such bread as I had never tasted. "We cannot leave you here, baby," he said, "and since you don't know where you belong, I will take charge of you." I no longer feared him or those with him. What cause had I to fear them? This man had stroked and petted and fed me. He had used me more kindly than I could remember to have ever been used before. So when presently I was perched in front of him on the withers of his great horse, I knew no sense but one of entire satisfaction. And I think I'm going to leave it on that slightly positive note. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.